All right, guys. So we are continuing our study on authentic Christianity. This is lesson 13. And our lesson for tonight's lesson, our title for tonight's lesson, and our title for probably the next two or three lessons is The Enemy Within. And the text that we're going to be looking at throughout the evening is 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 through 18. Now, we're not going to read that right now, but we will get to that. We will be reading that throughout our lesson. I wanted to start off talking about Thomas Cranmer. Thomas Cranmer was an Archbishop of Canterbury. That was back in the middle 16th century. Now, Cranmer is noted for a few things. He's noted for promoting the Reformation in England, for being one of the primary figures in getting the Coverdale English Bible out to the masses, especially in a time when an English translation was really frowned upon. And he's also well known for creating the liturgy for the Anglican Church. Now, he opposed the rule of the Pope in Rome, and his work was really to try to bring about a union between the Church of England and the Reformation movement in Germany, which was Luther and Calvin and the others. Now, he's also noted for his encounters with Mary Tudor, Queen of England. Mary Tudor was a devout Roman Catholic, and when she became Queen of England, she had him arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Now, he was convicted of treason and heresy and was deprived of sleep and subjected to continuous questioning, browbeating, berating for weeks on end. He was often threatened with torture and death. And under all this pressure, he signed a series of confessions in which he recanted his support for the Reformation. Anything that was in opposition to the Catholic Church, he recanted all that. He recanted on his proclamation of salvation by grace through faith and his belief that the scriptures belong to the people, not just the clergy. Now, even though he signed these recants that were demanded of him, and despite promises made to him that signing these documents would keep him from being killed, eventually these papers were presented as evidence against him in a trial in which he was condemned to death. The court condemned him to death by burning at the stake, but they told him that the sentence wouldn't be carried out if he made a public confession that was aligned with what he had signed. So he was taken before this really large crowd at St. Mary's Church in Oxford, England, and he was supposed to get up and confess his former errors, but instead he confesses what is on our screen right now. And I want you to look at that with me. He says, "My conscience will not let me deny the truth any longer, even to save my life. I have signed 7 recantations of the truth, and I bitterly regret each one. I abhor my right hand for signing the..."
Why don't you go in there with Dr. Vincent, Dr. Heather?
"And when they take me to the flames, I shall hold my right hand steadfastly in the flames." Now, as he was saying this, the authorities stopped him. They dragged him out of the church and they took him to be executed. And as the fire was being prepared, he trusted God to give him the strength to keep his promise. And with courage and conviction, he thrust his right hand into the flames and held it there until his death. Now, my point is boldness. Cranmer's boldness is pretty extraordinary. And it really is the inevitable result of trusting in Jesus Christ. It is the result of trusting in a new covenant approach to the faith, trusting in everything coming from God and nothing coming from me. Because the truth is this is something that most people want. Most people want boldness and courage and confidence. The problem is most people are searching for it in all the wrong places. They instinctively know just a second here. They instinctively know that any effective action must come from courage, from a confident spirit. Most people in our world know that boldness, courage, confidence, those are the things that make people listen. Those are the things that get things accomplished. So everybody works really hard to try to summing up that courage and confidence from within themselves, but they're all looking in the wrong place. Now, there is a form of boldness that we can find in ourselves, but it's always a fading glory. Now, that wasn't the source of Paul's boldness. Now, somebody read 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 12 for us.
Therefore, since we have such hope, we are very bold.
Paul found something different. His boldness came from a different place. He found the secret to real boldness because its basis was very different. Paul says, since we have such hope, we are very bold. Paul's triumphant conclusion to his discussion of the two covenants at work within us is that real hope creates real boldness, which is a conviction that God is already at work in us. Now, what do you think about this idea that real hope, real courage, real conviction, real confidence comes from our hope in Jesus Christ?
Jeff?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know if I was on or not. My King James for that says, seeing then that we have such hope, we use great plainness of speech. And then the concordance to that says clarity.
Right.
So I think that's interesting because boldness sometimes just means speaking the truth, speaking what you're reading, speaking what your beliefs are.
Yeah, not being afraid to tell the truth, not being afraid to confess what you really believe. And I like where Paul says this confidence comes from, this boldness, this plainness of speech. It comes from hope.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that kind of humbling? Real hope builds real courage and real conviction. A real hope in Jesus Christ is the only thing that can make us, as Cranmer did, face the flames of certain death and not be afraid. See, all who trust in hope, this hope in Jesus Christ, everyone who trusts like that becomes bold because they're not trusting in themselves. They're not trusting in what they do or what they avoid. They're not trusting in what they're doing on behalf of the Lord, but they're trusting on the Lord himself. And because of that, they can be confident. They can have hope. They can be courageous. They can know that my salvation is not dependent on me or how successful I am at doing certain things or avoiding certain things. My hope is built on the fact that Jesus Christ is God. And as God, he cannot fail. You see, since success does not depend on our dedication, our zeal, our wisdom, our background, our training, we can be bold. We can be courageous. Because the truth is, if my boldness is only about me and my abilities, then I've got no reason to be bold. I've got no reason to be courageous or confident. All I will be is cautious. But in Christ Jesus, I'll be bold because my hope is in him. It is God who does this, and he can be depended on to never fail. Now, that doesn't mean that he might not take an unexpected route to accomplish his goals that we're not looking for, that we're not expecting, but it does mean that we can trust him in any and every situation to always accomplish what he says he'll do. He delivers us completely from a fear of self and a fear of failure. And when we realize that Paul's boldness and our boldness is dependent on Jesus Christ, what else can we be but invincibly bold? Thoughts? You guys are being awfully quiet tonight.
Jeff, you're cutting in and out, so
Ours.
I think it's ours, but I've missed half the stuff you were saying, so I don't want to talk out of turn because I don't know.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Am I breaking up for anyone else?
Yeah, it's us.
Ours is really good.
Now, mostly what I was talking about in that last slide, guys, was that real boldness, real hope, real confidence and courage that comes from our hope in Jesus Christ, a hope that's not based in us. Now, somebody read 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 13.
And not as Moses, which put a veil over his face, that the children of Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of that which is abolished.
All right, thank you. So first, Paul tells us that our hope in Jesus is what makes us very bold. It's what gives us confidence because we're not hoping in us. But then he gives us this really amazing contrast of when Moses is afraid. Now, this is at least one time, one occasion when Moses really didn't live up to all that he was supposed to be. Now, we know there's other times like when he got angry and struck the rock. And one of the things that always teaches me and always impresses upon me is that, Moses was a real person. And he wasn't always perfect and he didn't get everything right. And what Paul says here is that Moses put this veil over his face partly because he didn't want the Israelites seeing what was fading away. In fact, that would imply that Moses was a little afraid, that he felt a little threatened that they might see this. Now, the Old Testament doesn't tell us about this. It doesn't say that. What it tells us was that Moses was not aware of the shining of his face when he came down from Sinai. And when everybody saw that, when they were closing their eyes, shielding their face, when they were afraid to be in his presence, he was asked to cover his face with a veil. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It was perfectly fine for him to do that in view of the circumstances. But Moses soon began to realize something was off. You see, the veil began as something good, but pretty soon it turned into something that wasn't. The veil that Moses put on his face every morning eventually began to hide the very fact that that glow was fading. But he still wore the veil, even when it was fading. Now, the question is why? Why did Moses keep putting on the veil when the glory was wearing off?
Probably because he wanted hope.
Okay.
Don't you think that they would think that maybe his faith in God was less?
Yeah, I mean, Paul says he didn't want them to see the end of this fading glory. So, from a very human perspective, imagine if you had something about you that really shined brightly that said, you are everything God wants you to be. You are the one who stood in the presence of God. Imagine yourself as Moses, but then imagine suddenly that glow began to fade. Wouldn't you not want to keep that a secret? Because your mark of privilege and status, your mark of being in the presence of God is disappearing, and you want to hide that. We would all be tempted to do that. So Moses did, I think, what millions of people have done ever since. He hid it. He didn't want anyone to see what was really going on, especially behind that veil. Now, there's a point to all this, and Paul's going to get into this more, and I think we need to really grasp the significance of this. What caused Moses to hide?
Maybe he thought, as with anybody, where people look up to you, it sort of goes to your head a little bit too, and you don't want them to think less of you because you still want to be thought of as something good.
Yeah. So Moses hid because he was afraid that people would see him for who he really was.
Well,
Fading glory and all.
Moses was losing. He felt like he was losing the power that he did not give to himself in the beginning. So he had a faulty view of this stuff, it seems like.
Yeah. And guys, isn't that really what we tend to do when we're ashamed or afraid someone will see something or learn something about us? We hide it, or we hide ourselves. We hide whatever it takes to keep that out of view of everyone else. Now, let's consider the veil here and what it really means, because the veil is really symbolic here. Somebody read 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 14 through 16.
But their minds were made dull, for to this day the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. It has not been removed, because only in Christ is it taken away. Even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away.
Thank you. See, now, it's in my mind, it's clear from what Paul is saying here that he's trying to teach us that this veil that Moses used to cover his face, to cover the fact that the glory was fading away, that becomes symbolic for Paul of our flesh, of the activity of the flesh. It's almost symbolic of pride. He even says that he still finds that same veil around in his day. The Jews of his time were a continuing example of people who tried to hide from God and from each other. Now, Exodus 24, verse 3, I'm going to read that one for us. Exodus 24, verse 3, it says, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Now, when Moses brought the 10 Commandments down from the mountain, face glowing, he read them to the people, and their immediate response was, we got this. We can do this. Anything and everything God says, we can do it. Now, how does that sound to you?
It sounds like they kind of got caught up in the glory of the moment.
Yeah. I mean, we've read the Old Testament, right? We know how difficult and how intricate all these rules and statutes were. And when they hear it, their response is, we got this. We can do this. All that God says we will do. I believe in that moment, the confidence and pride of their flesh rose up to say, we got whatever it takes to do whatever God wants of us. We are your people, and whatever you say we'll do, we will be perfectly obedient. But the truth was, before the day was over, they broke all 10 commandments. And, you know, they knew they couldn't keep this stuff. So why did they say that?
None of us like to admit frailty.
Absolutely. And I think that's exactly the point. They didn't want anyone else to know that they couldn't do it. Now, isn't that true of today's Christianity as well? Isn't that how we as people tend to do? We tend to don that veil of pride, to hide behind that veil, and we're afraid for anyone to see the real us. We want everyone else to see, I got this, I can do it. But a lot of times we're afraid to even consider the fact of being open and honest and transparent with people, because if they knew the real me, and I've heard people say this, if you knew the real me, you wouldn't like me. It is the facade. They covered up their failure and their inability to do this with rituals, religious rituals, and they convinced themselves that was all that God was really interested in. That was all he wanted. That pride that wouldn't allow them to admit that they couldn't do this was the very veil that hid their own failures and hid the ending of that fading glory. They could not see the end result of all this. And they could not feel the frustration and defeat that would be theirs when the flesh had finished its work. Now, this is true in Paul's day, and it's still true today. 1,500 years after Moses, Paul says the same veil is still at work in Israel. People are still hiding behind their rituals. They're still hiding behind their doors. They're hiding behind these facades. And they're still saying, it's okay, we got this, we can do this. Or at least they're saying, you know what, I'll do my very best. Even in modern Christians, the confidence that we can do something for God, that we can be good enough, that we can follow the rules, it blinds us to the fact that in and of ourselves, we can't do this. So just like Paul said for Israel, today the same veil remains unlifted over the eyes of most people, because they still believe they can do this. They still believe that if they try hard enough, if they know enough and they do it a lot enough, they practice and practice and practice, eventually they can get it right. Thoughts, ideas?
Jeff, could the veil also be like symbolically a barrier between the old covenant and the new covenant?
I don't think so. I mean, I wouldn't hesitate to say that it was a barrier between us and God. That the veil was representative of this barrier between the real us and letting God see the real us, or trying to hide that from him. I mean, that was really what Adam and Eve did, right? The first thing they did was hid.
Mm-hmm. I was just looking at verse 15 when it says, but even unto this day when Moses is read, the veil is upon their heart. And that's why I kind of thought maybe it was they were unwilling to accept the new covenant.
Yeah, because I think you really do have a point there, though, especially the way you said it that second time. That really does, I think, line up with the struggle that we all have. It's hard for us to let go of this idea that we can do it and embrace a new covenant. We want to live under this old covenant. We want to live in a way that is all about us something we can do and something we can control. Now,
We just need to be putting Jesus first rather than ourselves. We can't do it ourselves.
yeah, absolutely. You know, when someone says, you know, to be a Christian, you really have to be able to do this. And our instinctive response is, okay, I can do that. Or at least I'll try, I'll do my best. And too many times we say that is good enough. You know, I'll work hard and I'll do my best and got to be okay with that. Well, the truth is you can't be good enough. You can't do this well enough. And God is not okay with it. In and of ourselves, through our own fleshly ability, our own flesh, we can't do this. It is a facade. It is a lie that Satan tells each and every one of us. All you got to do is trust in yourself, work harder, do more, and you'll be okay. Got to be okay with that. It really is a false front, a facade. Now, let's think about these veils for a moment. Paul's point about this veil is it becomes symbolic of Moses trying to hide something, right? He's trying to hide the fact that the glory is fading away. And for us, the veil is also an attempt to hide something. Now, veils come in a lot of different shapes and forms, but they're all basically the same thing. It is an image or front that we project to others, and behind it, we hide the real us. It is always a form of pride, and it is always a form of hypocrisy. We don't want people to see our fading glory. Actually, we're reluctant to even admit it to ourselves that it's possible for us to fail. And that really is the problem with veils, right? When you wear a veil long enough, when you tell a lie long enough, what happens?
Becomes the unfortunate truth.
You start believing it, right? It becomes this unfortunate truth that you start believing in. That's the problem with a veil is after a while, we actually begin to believe that we are the kind of people we want everyone else to believe we are. And that's when it even gets worse because then our hypocrisy is unnoticed by us. Now, that doesn't mean nobody else doesn't see it. Everybody else does see the truth. And hypocrisy usually shines brightly, but it becomes unnoticed by us. I think that's what Jeremiah was talking about, this subtle deceitfulness of the heart. See, in Jeremiah 17, verse 9, he says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? Now, what better way to understand that than our hearts will lie to us about who we are. It'll lie to us about how good we are and how good we can accomplish these things. It is deceitful. It will lie to us. It is sinful, desperately sick, and we can't really understand all this. So we hold on to our veils. Because the veils that we use in our lives, they're varied. I mean, it could be any number of things. Pride has 1,000 faces, and it is a master of disguise. Now, I wanted to read to you a quote from C.S. Lewis. Before I read the quote, though, I want to tell you, if you've never read the book Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, let me encourage you to read that book. It is a challenging read, but there's some truths in there that I think will be very eye-opening and very humbling. Now, C.S. Lewis once said, or he said in this book on page 106, he said, there's one vice which no man in the world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when he sees it in someone else, and of which hardly any people except Christians ever imagine that they are guilty of themselves. There is no fault which makes a man more unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it in ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. The vice I'm talking about is pride or self-conceit, and the virtue opposite to it in Christian morals, it is called humility. Now, I think what C.S. Lewis is saying here is, pride, the deceitfulness of the heart, it really causes us to be blind to our own sins, to our own failures, to our own inabilities, and it really causes us to focus on everyone else and what they're doing. It causes us to focus on their guilt. Now, when you look back over the history of the church, doesn't that sound familiar? We get so fixated on someone else's mistakes that we're not seeing ours.
Mhm.
And yet, let me tell you something. These veils, they can be necessary to ego, and they can be necessary to self-worth, because they're ways that we invent. These are lies that we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel more important, to make ourselves feel better about who we are and what we're doing. Now, what do you think the most popular way of doing this, of holding on to our veil and causing us to focus on other people and not ourselves? If you spent much time in the church and you spent much time watching people and dealing with people, you've seen this happen. The most popular way of holding on to our veils is we have two names for the same thing. See, when a form of pride appears in someone else, we got a name for that. But when the same thing appears in us, we've got a much nicer name for it. Let me give you examples. Other people have prejudices, but we have convictions. Other people are conceited, but we're just having self-respect. Others keep up with the Joneses, and we're just trying to get ahead. Others blow up, lose their tempers, but we're simply responding to the situation. Or better yet, I heard one person say, I was just seized with righteous indignation. Other people are not trusting in Jesus, they're trusting in themselves, and they're trusting in their works, but we're simply trying to be obedient Christians. Things sound familiar, don't they?
Mhm.
You see, that's a veil. It's one of these ways that we convince ourselves that we're better than we really are. It's this veil we hide behind. Other people are sinners, and we call sin for what it is. But when it's us, we got nicer names for it. We want to make it seem like it's not such a big deal. Take false modesty, for example. Now, you know what I'm talking about when I say false modesty, right?
Yeah, you stand in the middle of a room shooting a Roman candle and say, "Oh, there's nothing to see here."
Yeah. It's one of the things that kind of shocks me at times, even when I see it happening, is that, someone will stand and talk very proudly about how modest and humble they are.
Come let us adore me, right?
Yeah, I mean, seriously, Christians have always been susceptible to that kind of veil, especially those which appear to be some form of virtue.
It's like everybody toots their own horn.
Absolutely.
I've also heard, I'm just telling you the truth. I don't lie.
Yeah, which, when someone says, I'm going to tell you the truth, you better beware, because it's probably not. I long ago learned that when I hear someone say, I'm only trying to serve the Lord in my own way, that I'm probably talking to the proudest person in the entire state. Saint Jeremiah, which was one of the early church fathers from the 2nd century, which, he lived within 50 years of the apostles. And one of his famous things was he would always say, beware of the pride of humility. Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but I read this story one time. So this might be true, it might not, but it really does fit right where we're talking about. I heard of a congregation, I read a story about a congregation that gave its preacher a medal for his humility. But then they took it away because he put it on. Now, like I said, I don't know if that's true or not, but I could totally see that happening. True humility is never aware of itself. It is most noteworthy that the greatest saints throughout history have been the most aware of their sin and their prides. The truly humble person never sees this in themselves. You never hear them talking about how great they are, how religious they are. You never hear them talk about how humble or righteous they are. Because if you do hear someone talking about that, it's a dead giveaway that they're hiding behind their own pride.
I'm afraid that the Lord would zap me because I know I sin, and it's out there for everybody to see. You can't hide it. You keep covering it up, but you can't hide it.
Oh, and that's the thing is, this facade that we have perpetrated in the churches for so long is that in order to be saved, you got to be good enough. And what I mean is you got to know exactly what God wants, and you got to do it exactly the way he wants it. You got to call it exactly what he calls it, and anything less than exactly, and you're lost. And then we perpetuate this lie that we can actually do all that, and that we do. And when we hold up this veil for everyone else to look at and say, look at us, we're the Lord's people, we're the Lord's church, and we get it right. When more likely, nothing could be further from the truth. Do we get certain aspects of it right? Absolutely. Does that mean we get it right all the time? Absolutely not. Now, here's some veils, and I want us to talk a little bit about these veils that Christians typically wear. Self-righteousness. Now, when you hear the word self-righteous, what do you think?
Somebody that brags on themselves.
Somebody that brags on themselves.
Someone so right in their own eyes.
What was that, Nancy? Say that again.
Someone who thinks they're right in their own eyes,
Very good. I like that one.
not in God's righteousness. I'm
They're
gonna
right.
this with
Sorry, I missed all that. Somebody else was saying something too.
I said that they're right and everyone else is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that, right? I mean, I hate to admit it, but I've been that. I'm right and everybody else is wrong.
the only right that covers us is Jesus' righteousness.
Absolutely.
I feel like I've done that a lot myself.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not ashamed to admit it. I'm not going to hide behind it and present myself as, overly righteous. I've been there and I've done that. I've said things like that. I'm right and everybody else is wrong. And I point that out because I think this is a really horrible form of Christian pride. Because it really focuses on some standard of conduct some way of worship, some name, and it takes pride in its own ability to measure up to that standard while conveniently overlooking every other failure in their life. And the end result is this person who's smug and they're patronizing, and they can be very nasty toward anyone who doesn't meet their standards. And that's what I see when I hear the term self-righteous. And, you know, it's something that I've seen in all churches. And, you know, and I've been around churches all my life, all kinds of churches. And, you know, there's people in every one of them who are just these self-righteous, patronizing, horrible people to be around Christians. The truth is, you know, this self-righteousness, that's the thing Jesus focused on more than anything else. You think about it, 90% of what Jesus taught was against self-righteousness. He exposed it in the Pharisees. And I mean, he even went so far as to say adulterers and people from other nations and tax collectors would enter the kingdom of heaven before them because they were so self-righteous. They believed they were right, and they were not willing to consider that just maybe they were not. It is the sin of the crusader, the person who mounts their white horse and rides out to fight against any form of sin that they find reprehensible. But, you know, I have learned something over my years as a Christian and as a preacher, that if a person tends to fixate on one sin, that's probably the sin they struggle with the most. I used to know a guy that focused on adultery. It was probably 80% of what he preached. And if the title wasn't don't commit adultery to his sermon or his Bible class, he would bring it up somehow. Everything would kind of come back to this, don't be an adulterer. And over time, we learned that this person was having affairs with several different people, not just women, several different people. I've noticed that when someone really fixates on how good they are and how bad everybody else is, when they really fixate on one specific sin or one specific problem, that they're being self-righteous and they're probably struggling with that very sin themselves. Now, what about nagging? You ever thought about that being a veil that we wear? When you hear the term nagging, what do you think?
Pain.
Husband and wife.
Husband and wife.
Judy's laughing her head off right now, so I'll let you carry that one.
Now, this is not true in every aspect of nagging, because, you know, there's times when I definitely need somebody to keep poking the bear, so to speak, and get me to do what I need to do. There's time when I need that prodding. But more often than not, nagging is a form of pride and a form of self-righteousness, because you're focusing on one aspect of someone else's life, one area of their existence, and how they don't measure up to how you do it.
Can it not be complaining too?
Yeah, I think so. And I think complaining can really kind of fit right in there as well. Because the truth is instinctively we retreat behind this veil whenever our own failures and weaknesses are exposed. I may be weak, but at least I'm not like that person. We keep our self-righteous veils close at hand so we can put it on quickly to keep others from seeing the real us, from seeing, to quote Paul, the fading glory. Being overly sensitivity or touchiness. When you think about that, what do you think?
Basically, right now, this entire country, I've never seen anything like it. Really, I mean, it takes nothing to offend somebody anymore. All the shootings we have, the road rage, I mean.
See, I think of that person who's touchy, who's excessively sensitive, whose feelings are easily hurt by the words or actions of someone else, because these people have to be handled with kid gloves. And if not, they get offended. And when they're offended, this becomes a big ordeal. When they're upset, it's a big deal. When they're offended or they're hurt, they tend to wallow in that. They tend to do it for days on end, and they want to make sure everyone else knows all about it.
You have to walk on eggshells because it'll make somebody mad if you say the wrong word.
Yeah.
Or they squabbling and carrying on, which I do.
I'm an overly sensitive person and I realize it. But
Years
I don't
ago,
know how to
well,
stop it.
I think we can all be overly sensitive. I don't think you're the only one. I think it's something we all struggle with. Very few people, and I have met a few, very few people that I've ever met are really not prone to being touchy or sensitive or overly sensitive.
Or they
And- Go ahead, Nancy.
hold grudges.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have to be careful because I could very easily hold a grudge.
Yeah. And usually a grudge is something someone nurses and holds on to for years upon years. I've seen grudges destroy churches. And usually it's because of, someone was thoughtless or someone was rude or somebody said something they shouldn't have said to me. And a lot of times, it's because we don't feel as important as we think we are or as important as we would like to be.
I've seen it in
for me personally, it's easy to get overly sensitive because I feel like I'm not being respected or paid attention to, or like I'm not as important as I think I should be. I mean, I had a Christian lady at the first church I preached for in Kentucky. She told me something that I'll never forget. She said, I've learned something. She says, more often than not, sensitivity is selfishness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at that moment, I was really struggling with being touchy over some things that was happening in that church and how I was being treated by some people and my family was being treated. And basically, she was like, listen, you're kind of being a little selfish. This is not all about you. Now, she had MS. She couldn't walk. She couldn't drive. She had to be pushed around in a wheelchair. And this woman had the most powerful faith I've ever met. She was a force of nature. And she had this way of just really putting things in a way that, really made it stick home for you. And that's what she said. Sensitivity is more often than not selfishness. And at that time, it was true for me. But that being overly sensitive can become a veil that we wear. The same thing with being impatient. When you think of impatience, what are you thinking about? What does it make you think of?
Can't wait.
Can't wait.
Someone who wants control.
So, ooh, I didn't think about it like that. I think there's some real truth in that as well.
Could you repeat that? I didn't hear it.
Someone who wants control.
You see, for a lot of people, an impatient person is really just a veil that hides the reality of what we are, what we think we are. It often manifests when we want to be more important, or we think we're more important than other people. One of the things that I've struggled with, and Melinda she'll be honest with you and say I struggle with being impatient.
Mhm.
Did you hear that? The big thing with being impatient, and the reason why I list this as a veil that we often wear, is because being impatient is really just a form of pride. It's I'm too important to wait. I'm too important to have to slow down and be kind or patient with other people. I should be able to do it as quickly as I want to without any interruptions. I shouldn't have to wait. I shouldn't have to follow anyone else. And that's a really humbling thought for me, because impatience really can be this veil that hides this really deeper, we're struggling with our own self-worth and our own self-righteousness.
Don't you think that's all of society today? Because just like driving down the road, you see the road rage, standing in line at the grocery store, anywhere, everybody's impatient and they think they need to go now. I don't need to be waiting.
I think
Absolutely.
we've had to be impatient for the last year and a half, and it's about time people kind of try to think clearly when we go out and about.
Absolutely.
Well, our fast food restaurants aren't.
That lady that you were talking about, I don't think she had the right to tell you that.
Well, maybe, but I think it was what I needed to hear at the time.
If people tactfully say things, you don't mind it as if somebody orders you to do something.
Well, and one of the things that I didn't say was, the relationship between me and her was real and strong enough where, she really did have the right to be open and honest with me, because she'd earned that right,
Exactly.
It's like a real good friend can tell you the truth. They will
Yeah.
tell you the truth where somebody you don't know as well won't.
Right.
Yeah. Almost anyone else, if they had said what she said to me, I would have been offended, and I'd have probably been right to been so. But she really was genuinely and sincerely just trying to help me. And I knew that. That's why I say, it was really what I really needed to hear at that moment.
But I think that patience is like, or impatience or whatever, is that when you want it done right then because you don't have patience. So that's when
Yeah.
humbleness comes in.
Absolutely. Humility is the opposite of impatient. There's also this self-justifying. And what I mean is, and you've probably experienced this, is someone who does something or says something, but they always want a chance to explain. They're always justifying what they did or what they said. And really, it just kind of reveals this very same impatient, self-righteous person who kind of wants to hide behind it. They can't stand to be misunderstood, and they're always trying to explain their words or their actions. But more often than not, what they're really saying is, I want you to think that I'm perfect. Now, of course, I know that my actions just prove that not true, but let me explain so you can believe that.
Yeah, but and on the other, if you're on the other end, this is when you actually get patient.
Yeah.
And, you know, the Holy Spirit's telling you, be humble right now, you know?
Yeah.
And have patience with this person that is impatient. Right?
Yeah. Guys, I'm not talking about these veils because I want to point them out in anyone else, or that I want to point them out in myself, in myself, and my own mistakes. We're talking about these veils because a veil is something we hide behind, and it usually manifests itself in very specific ways, like self-righteousness or fixating on someone else and their inability to measure up to the standard, nagging. Sometimes it manifests itself in being overly sensitive. It doesn't mean that, you know, these things are not legitimate, and there's not times when we need to remind ourselves that we are Christians, that we are righteous, that we need to get up and go do this thing. Sometimes it manifests itself in being impatient with other people or justifying our actions, trying to justify the things that we said or the things that we did, or even our failures to say or do the right things. But more often than not, these veils we hide behind, this old covenant approach to our faith and to our life, it usually manifests itself in hiding. That's how Adam and Eve did it. It's how most of the people you read about in Scripture who struggle with sin, it's how they did it. It's probably the most common veil employed by Christians. It is being remote, hiding from the church, hiding from other people, keeping our feelings and our attitudes, sometimes even our entire life, to ourselves, hiding that from even our closest friends and relatives. And that's really a result of our own fears. You know, we're afraid of being known for what we are. We're afraid of people talking about us. We're afraid of being judged. We're afraid of being rejected. And more often than not, these veils, this approach to the faith through this old covenant way of looking at and doing things, manifests itself in these ways. And we mention these things, we bring them up to make us more aware of those things in our own hearts and in our own lives. Because the truth is we're often blind to our own sin. It's hard to see our veils, because once we put that veil on and once we start hiding behind it, we almost get blind to the fact that it's there. We can't see it anymore. And we put up this facade for everyone else to see, and pretty soon we begin to believe that we are everything we want others to think. Questions, thoughts?
Yeah, Jeff, you know, most of those things that you have listed right here come under the heading of a kind of a clinical diagnosis called covert narcissism. Happens in many different, no, it is. I mean, it's in many different levels. Judy and I both had to try to figure out how to deal with family in the past over stuff like this. And the definition of that is a constant searching for recognition and validation. And you look
Absolutely.
at somebody nagging, overly sensitive, impatient. I mean, you know, we all get that, but when it gets really toxic, it's horrible.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is, you know, if you've had to really deal with a narcissist, someone who manifests all these things in their life, you get really good at seeing it.
Yeah.
But it's always difficult to deal with.
Yeah, because they go the other direction. The more it's obvious to us, the less it is to them, and the more defensive they are. It's
absolutely. All right, guys. Any questions or comments before we end tonight?
It just makes you take a look at yourself.
That's for sure.
Absolutely. And, you know, we've been talking about this old covenant approach and this new covenant approach and trying to see the differences. But now we're getting to a bit more personal with it and trying to apply those things and see how this old covenant approach to the faith manifests itself in our own lives, so that we can see the truth of, what we're doing and how we're doing things. Because the end goal for these classes and for the churches, we want authentic Christianity. We want to be able to open the scriptures and say, that's what we're striving to be. All right, guys, if there's no questions or comments, Jim, would you mind leading us in a closing prayer?
Sure. Bow with me, if you will. Father, thank you once again for the beautiful life you've given us, for the hope, the positivity, just knowing that everything will be all right if we follow your son. Please be with those who need the help. Let us do what we can to help them. Please keep us moving in the right direction and keep us looking upwards always. In your son's name we ask. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Jim.